welcome everyone to Joan Borsenko's closing plenary session, The Art and Science of Resilience, From Surviving to Thriving. We hope you enjoyed the afternoon refreshments generously provided by the Oxley Foundation. My name is Irene Warwick. I have served as a member of the Mental Health Association's Oklahoma Education and Zarrow Symposium Planning Committee for almost the past 15 years. And I'm also the longtime leader of the association's depression support group here in Tulsa. Before Dr. Borsenko begins her talk, I have a few housekeeping items. Somebody in the audience has a iPhone, a black iPhone that has a pink, I think it was a D on the back of it. So if you happen to come across an iPhone, take it up to the front registration area. When you leave the conference today, your certificates of attendance can be picked up at the conference registration desk. We do ask that you wait to pick up your certificate until you are ready to leave the conference. Just as a reminder, there is a $5 charge to mail a certificate or issue a replacement. $5, people. All right. We ask that you please complete your conference evaluation, which is printed on blue paper and was included in your bag. Extra copies are available at the registration desk. Please turn your completed form in when you pick up your certificate. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate your time. Now let me introduce Dr. Joan Borsenko. Dr. Borsenko is a world-renowned expert in the mind-body connection. She is also founder and president of Mind Body Health Sciences in Boulder, Colorado, and a New York Times best-selling author of 16 books. Her work has been foundational in an international healthcare revolution that recognizes the role of meaning and the spiritual dimensions of life as an integral part of health and healing. You might even consider this a preview of the 2015 Zarrow Mental Health Symposium, which will focus on integrating healthcare, mind, body, and spirit. Dr. Borsenko is a licensed psychologist with a doctorate in cell biology from Harvard Medical School. Her specialty is synthesizing cutting-edge science with the deep humanity. I'm excited to hear her perspectives on the anatomy of change that joins psychology, health, and narrative medicine. If you'd like to meet Dr. Borsenko, I knew I would botch her name. Dr. Borsenko, she will be available after her presentation at the book table. Also, her latest book will be available September 30th, and it is called The Plant Plus Diet Solution, Personalized Nutrition for Life. So September 30th, look for her new book. Now help me in welcoming Dr. Joan Borsenko.
Thanks, Irene. Hi, everybody. How's your conference been? Absolutely wonderful. Yes, it has been great. What a wonderful dinner that was last night, too, wasn't it? Just such a gala event. So well done. So I am completely delighted to be here with you and to be your final speaker at this conference. And people frequently say to me, how did a scientist get interested in mental health? And then they follow that up and they said, how did a scientist get interested in the spiritual dimensions of life? So I want to start with a story. When I was 10, I became rather abruptly psychotic, and then I developed OCD to manage my psychosis. This is the beginning. I'd seen a really scary movie with my mother called White Witch Doctor, and I started at night to dream about the jungle stuff in that movie, snakes and headhunters and scorpions. And very quickly, maybe a week after that, I started to hallucinate them during the day. And then I couldn't tell anymore the difference between dream and reality. But I believed, and if you're mentally ill like this, what you believe seems to you absolute truth. I believed that I could see the headhunters, just kind of not entirely solid, but kind of transparent, not quite manifest. And that because I was the only one who could see them, I was responsible for the safety of my parents because I thought they would kill my family. And that's where the OCD came in, because I invented ritual after ritual, started with hand washing, and it went to things like having to turn my books upside down, which means that you have to read backwards. And I'd have to read everything 3 times before I could stop. And if I was interrupted, it was absolutely terrifying. After a while, it got hard to go to school, for sure. In fact, here's an interesting mind-body medicine anecdote. So I'm hallucinating the headhunters at the end of a corridor in school. It's 5th grade. And I believe I've been hit by a poison dart. And my whole left arm swelled up. It was huge and throbbing and red. So I go to the nurse and I say, you better call an ambulance right away because I have just been hit by a poison dart. If you ever wanted to get out of school, I will assure you, that line works really well. And it was a while before I came back again. Now, here's the interesting part of the story. Clearly, I recovered, which is a good thing, and it shaped my life. It really, I think, it was part of what became for me my life purpose. And here's how I got well from it, and how I got interested in the field of mental health, brain science, and psychology, which is what we're going to look at, plus meaning, the nature of meaning and narrative medicine. So I did not come from a family that was big on prayer. My mother, 12 people in my mother's side of the family died in Auschwitz. And her response to that was, don't give me this BS about a loving God, or babies wouldn't be gassed, and there wouldn't be Holocausts for as long as we know worldwide. So it was not what was happening, but I think it was either Mother Teresa or Peace Pilgrim who once said, there are no atheists in foxholes. And so I figured I might as well pray. Who knows? Maybe something will happen. And I had a truly unusual experience for which I had no context at all. And it was, as far as I can tell, an experience of cosmic consciousness, when you become suddenly aware, or I'll say I became aware, that everything was interconnected to everything else. And the felt sense of everything was love, this amazing love, and not an impersonal love, but a very personal love. And that state was also characterized by a kind of intuition, a kind of wisdom. And I just knew a couple of things. One of the things I knew was that it was possible to recover from mental illness. And then what I was absolutely sure of is that I could recover. And I also knew this, that if I ever did another ritual, I was going to stay stuck there. And so I started to think, how can I not do another ritual? Because it's what keeps the headhunters from coming. And what happened is all of a sudden this poem started to compose itself in my head. And I wrote the poem down while I was in this state, and I thought, every time I'm scared, I'll just recite the poem to myself, because it's connected to this beautiful state I'm in where there's no fear. And, don't try this with your clients or yourself, because it probably isn't going to work. It was idiosyncratic to me, although it reminds me a little bit of the work of Jeff Schwartz at UCLA, who has written actually several books, but one called Brain Lock about OCD. So essentially, I invented a superordinate ritual that replaced all the others. Do you want to hear the poem? Yeah? Okay, now remember, cut me a break. I was only 10 when I wrote it. But until this day, when the going gets rough, and the going does get rough in life, doesn't it? Life is difficult. There's no question about it. I say this poem, and I call it The Light. Somewhere in the darkest night, there always shines a little light. This light up in the heavens shines to help our God watch over us. When a small child is born, the light her soul does adorn. So when our only human eyes look up in the lightless skies, we must know that this light burns far into the night to help our God watch over us. And with that poem, I didn't feel so alone, because I couldn't talk to my parents after a while. So they'd taken me to every good psychiatrist in Boston. This was over 50 years ago, so there was no Klonopin, no Prozac, no behavior therapy, nothing. And so I just kind of quit talking to them about it, because I could hear them crying themselves to sleep at night behind their bedroom door. But with the poem, I knew we may have, I'm going to steal a line from Einstein, who said, the idea that we're separate from one another is an optical delusion of consciousness. And what I experienced is we're not. Everything is interconnected, and we're never alone. So that's how come I'm standing here now, because I had that experience, and it awakened in me interest that grew up as I grew up. So I was interested in the 5th grade in biology. I had a terrific teacher. And I was thinking to myself, what happens when somebody who's normal one day becomes mentally ill the next? And I figured, has to be something about the brain. Gotta study the brain. So that was primary in my mind. Then, of course, I think that it's really common for a child who's been ill to want to grow up and help other people with whatever it was that they had. So I thought, it'd be pretty good to study psychology. And then the spiritual experience I had no context for. It was, I didn't know anything about it. And I thought, I think I would like to study the world's religions, which was not so easy to do in 1955. There was no internet. But little by little over the years, I became acquainted with the literature of everything from mystical Christianity to mystical Judaism to Eastern religions to different native tribal religions, although I hesitate to call those religions as such. But I realized that common to all of them was something that we think of as mental health, not doctrine, not dogma, nothing else, but that common to all of them was when you're in a place of peace and harmonious within yourself, you experience a constellation of positive emotions. And I was amazed when I saw Dr. George Vaillant. Some of you know him as a psychiatrist from Harvard Medical School, who's studied alcoholism quite a bit, and he's written many books, and one of my favorites is called Adaptation to Life. What Dr. Vaillant says is spirituality is really a constellation of 8 positive emotions. They sound a lot. For those of you who went to Catholic school, who went to Catholic school? Okay, can you recite the fruits of the Spirit? No? How about love, joy, peace, compassion? Dr. Vaillant adds forgiveness, gratefulness, things of that nature. And when you take the stress off of the human system, when we return to what some of my Buddhist friends would call true nature, that's what's underneath there. That's who we are. And my idea of resilience is when things get very, very tough and we're pushed way out of our comfort zone, resilience is not about bouncing back to what you were before. It's about uncovering that true self and truly coming to home in yourself and the universe with a greater sense of patience and compassion for yourself and others, and also good boundaries that have to balance that off, and a sense of peace and love that's contagious. Because what all the new research in interpersonal neurobiology has to tell us is that as human beings, as mammals, due to the fact, our vagus nerve has two branches, the lower branch beneath the diaphragm, and an upper branch that innervates the striated muscles of the upper face. And what makes people feel safe is when that upper vagus nerve is stimulated and your face looks friendly. And what we know is that healthcare providers with friendly faces and who are comfortable and at home in themselves act like tuning forks for their clients. There's a huge literature really coming up around this, that we are in fact the medicine. And as we heal ourselves, we become a very notable healing presence for our family, our friends, and our clients. So with that introduction, I want to say I was hanging out in my room this morning, having met some of you yesterday and last night, and heard Patrick Kennedy speak, and I completely changed my slide presentation. So if you're trying to follow along on the other one is really a lovely presentation, but I just got all excited and I said, I really want to link this more to not only the brain science, but some of the new studies and what's going on actually in our gut, not in our gut with our gut bacteria, and how that affects our mental health. I thought we'd have a kind of cutting edge time. How's that sounding to you? Good? All right, so let's get to it. So, this is my old friend, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and not this June, but the June before, I get invited to be one of 4 Western scientists who was to go for 2 days of debate at His Holiness's Mensakong Institute for Tibetan Medicine and Astrology. Around here, the NIH does not have a branch for medicine and astrology, but they do. And I've known him for many, many years. I've met him several times and been able to be in dialogue with him several times. And what he said to me is, he said, Joan, what do you think comes first, the body or the mind? And I said to him, Your Holiness, I think that the mind comes first, and out of it we grow a body. And he laughs. He's always laughing. He's so charming and chuckly. And so he said to me, that's what I believe. But he said, as far as Western science goes, you're a terrible Western scientist. So that was true. I'm actually a pretty good Western scientist, I think. But anyhow, I was interested in looking at what goes on in Dharamsala, where the Tibetans live in exile, because I'm very interested in resilience. And that's part of what I got to do on that trip. I had the good fortune of being able to invite a couple of the other Western scientists. And I brought my friend Jim Gordon, who runs the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington, D.C., because he works with victims of trauma, Holocaust, and war all over the world. He takes teams of therapists that he's trained to deal with trauma, and they in turn train teams from everywhere, from Kosovo to Palestine. And it's quite amazing because instead of coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do to you, he trains the local people in how to deal with the trauma. And I think that resilience is very, very important, because as we train people for resilience, not only do we do it after the fact, but hopefully before the fact. So the unfortunate, very unfortunate suicides that we're seeing now for people who have been back from the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, 8,000 suicides a year, one every 29 minutes. We need to be able to train our troops in resilience before they go. And there are a lot of programs that are doing that. But I think we all need to be resilient right now. You know, my God, you turn on the news and it's enough to give you an anxiety disorder, that's for sure. So not only do we need to be resilient, we need to train our children how to be resilient. And that is near and dear to my heart. So I want to take a look first at just a psychological way of looking at this. That the way that we perceive the world, the way we think about things, makes all the difference between whether we feel helpless, whether we're easily knocked off of our center, or whether we are resilient. And so I want to give you a little brief introduction to work that I have found to be a good map, for me at least, over the last 30 years or so. One of them is Martin Seligman. And Seligman looked at explanatory styles in people who became helpless and depressed. And explanatory style is everything. It's like, what's your view of the universe? Why do you think that something bad happens when it happens? And you know, for a number of years, I ran a clinic at one of the Harvard Medical School teaching hospitals. I had a cancer clinic. Then in 1982, when the AIDS epidemic really got going, I started an AIDS clinic. And then I ran a clinic for people with stress-related disorders. And I always asked every single client who came to the clinic with an illness whether they had a theory about why they were ill. And you know, most people do. Not everybody, but certainly I heard from people with AIDS lots of things that were not so good for their nervous system and their immune system. When they would say things like, God is punishing me for being gay, the natural corollary of that, of course, is that when I die, I'm going straight to hell. And this is not something that's very good for your health when you hold that kind of a belief system. And so it's very important for all of us at all times to notice, what is it that we believe? And there's a whole new field of epigenetics that we'll touch on in a few minutes that looks at the fact that what you believe releases from your brain and from your endocrine system various informational molecules, small peptides. There are receptor sites for those on every cell in the body, and therefore your belief affects your cellular function. It actually affects which genes become activated and which ones become silenced. And so we're understanding a lot more now about that mind-body connection. So the explanatory style of people who are pessimistic and helpless, this is the opposite of being resilient, is what Seligman calls personal, pervasive, and permanent. So I will give you a brief tour through this, what it is. So maybe, 30-ish years ago, I had heard Martin Seligman give a talk. I lived in Boston at the time, and he gave a talk about this. Literally the next weekend, I had a chance to notice that my own thinking style was pessimistic. What happened was that we'd just gotten a boat, my husband was away for the weekend, and my teenage son and his 11-year-old brother, my other son, said, let's take the boat out. And I said, but I don't know anything about boating. And my 15-year-old Justin said, in the way that only a 15-year-old can, what's to boating? We get in the boat, we pull the rope, the engine starts. I've done this a million times with my friends. It's a beautiful day. We'll go down the North River and out into the Atlantic. So I figure, what can hurt? We'll go out in the boat. We go out in the boat. It's a gorgeous day. We get to the ocean. All is well. But I'm wondering why there are red and green buoys floating all over. And I said, Justin, what's with the red and green buoys? And he says, beats me. By now, the tide has gone out. North River is a tidal river and a very dangerous one, it turns out. We come back up the river, and pretty soon we run aground on a sandbar. Well, it occurs to all of us at this moment, the buoys. They mark the navigable channel, and that's where we are. So this is a minor negative event, and explanatory style is how we explain negative events that happen. And so my inner dialogue is like something from Woody Allen. I'm thinking like, oh God, we're on a sandbar. It's my own fault. What a rotten mother I am. What kind of mother who knows nothing about buoys takes their innocent children out on a boat? I'll tell you who, a working mother, that's who. These children, they'll be in therapy for 30 years because you raised them. And then I'm thinking my research isn't going that well either. I bet my grant won't be funded because it's just too hard to balance all of the commute and the work and the kids and everything else. And my marriage sucks too. So that is a pessimistic statement, essentially. Because it was personal. It was all my own fault. It was pervasive. It wasn't just about being on a sandbar. Heck, I mess up everything I do, and it's permanent. It's the story of my life. That was my narrative, my baseline narrative. No wonder I had so many psychosomatic ills all the time and other things like that. My son Justin, however, responded very, very differently. He looked at me beaming, and he said, "Wow, this is the best day of my whole life." And I said, "The best day of your life? I'm missing something here." And he says, "Yes, I'm the captain of the ship, and I will rescue us." And it took him really about 2 minutes to do that. It had to, I don't know, he threw the anchor out and pulled the boat out, and, you know, we rolled up our pants and pushed, and we were in the boat in a moment, knowing a lot now about buoys. And I thought, oh, I don't know where this child came from. I know he came from my womb, but I can hardly believe it. Because he personified some work of Suzanne Willette-Kobasa, who'd worked with another psychologist, Salvador Matti, when they'd worked 6 years in a corporate system, one of the Bell systems. I think it was Illinois Bell, could be the wrong one. But in any case, the company was undergoing divestiture, and they wondered which of the management folks were going to be okay with this and who would get sick, who would start to abuse substances, who would become anxious and unable to cope. So this is very useful because they helped us to understand what can come before addiction, mental illness, and that kind of thing, which is our topic today, all things prevention. What they found was that stress-hardy people were like Justin. He didn't see being on a sandbar as a threat. He saw it as a challenge. Also, he kept a sense of control that was specific to what was going on. We're stuck on a sandbar. He was trying to control getting off. I, on the other hand, was trying to control my whole out-of-control life. And commitment is the third of the 3 C's. And what it means is that when the going gets rough, instead of kind of checking out, you stay involved. You hang right in there with whatever it is. So I've always liked this because the 3 P's of pessimism and helplessness just are wonderfully opposite to the 3 C's of stress hardiness. And what Seligman has said is once you know what pessimism looks like, if you can dispute your story and say, is it really true that my children will have to be in therapy 30 years? Actually, about 15 did it. But you have to dispute that and back up from it. And instead of letting your amygdala totally take you over, you got to get your prefrontal cortex on board. And we're going to talk about how to do that in just a few minutes. Okay, now, when we look at prevention, other than being pessimistic, we can go back there and to say, what would it be often in somebody's background that might cause that kind of narrative? Well, I think many of you are very well aware of the ACE studies, so we're only going to spend about 2 minutes on it. How many of you know the ACE study research? Okay. How many of you don't know that research? Okay. So it's probably 60 know and 40 don't. But I found it very, very interesting, the story of how it came about at Kaiser Permanente, because Vincent Felitti, who's the first author of most of this research, is such a compassionate person and so mindful. And so when people started dropping out of an obesity intervention, instead of just, they dropped out, he interviewed them all. And he heard stories from them like, I've been very successful losing weight, but the more weight I lose, the more anxious I feel. And then he would hear stories, well, Uncle Joe got a hold of me behind the barn when I was 14, and I put on 100 pounds in the next 2 years. And now, losing the weight, I feel vulnerable again. And he began to realize that pretty much all of the habits that we judge and consider bad habits, that may range from alcoholism to cigarette smoking to overeating, are actually a person's best method of keeping themselves safe. And I thought, what a wonderful way to look at this, to take judgment out of the picture here. And as you know, his work bridges the gap between childhood trauma and health and mental health consequences later in life. And just a reminder, I think we could all recite the various categories of adverse childhood experiences, like physical and emotional abuse, sexual abuse, an addiction in your household, or somebody in your household in jail. And I've been on the board of the Lionheart Foundation for 20 years now. And Lionheart is a program of emotional literacy and the discovery of self aimed at prisoners. And there's a book for this program called Houses of Healing and a facilitator's manual. This is one of the best programs in the entire area of corrections. We should all take the Houses of Healing program. And this is the idea. Why should prisons be graduate schools in violence? They should be houses of healing. And the kind of behavior that gets people into prison usually goes back to this kind of background that they've got, and it needs to be remediated. So not only do you often, thank you, see that a household member is incarcerated, but often whole families, the kids, the parents, the grandparents, and this is handed down. This is where we have to start. And by the way, Lionheart Foundation, look that up, has got another book called Power Source Healing for Youth at Risk, and all these have wonderful facilitators manuals. And then they have a third program called Power Source Parenting for basically youth at risk who've gotten pregnant and have children of their own, because that's where we need to really intervene, I think. Okay, Vincent Felitti has this remarkable word. He says, how do we start with a child who's all gold and turn the child into lead? And so just look at, I'm sure you know these, but I'm always amazed that a male child with an ACE score of 6, and your total score can't be any more than 9, has a 4,600% increase in the probability of becoming an IV drug abuser. An ACE score of 4 increases the probability of COPD by 390%. I came from a lovely family, and due to circumstances in part beyond their control, I have an ACE score of 4. I smoked for a long time, and my lung function isn't great. Did I want to smoke? No, but it gave me a sense of safety and belonging. I can see why people would smoke or do drugs or anything else. An ACE score of 4 or more raises the probability of depression almost 500%, and an ACE score of 4 or more raises the probability of suicide by 1,220%. It's the kids and the at-risk youth where I think we really need to intervene in terms of prevention. But of course, this isn't the whole story. We have not only experienced the nature and the nurture, we have genetics. Maybe schizophrenia runs in the genes of the family. And why do some people who have those genes express it in schizophrenia where other people don't? That's where the field of epigenetics that we'll look at in a moment comes in. But as we understand more and more now about science, we've come to some very interesting discoveries, and that is the telomeres, like the little, I think of them as like the plastic tips on shoelaces that keep the shoelaces from unraveling, are shorter in children who are abused. The shorter your telomeres, the less able you're to repair your tissues, the less long you will live, and the greater chance there is of developing chronic illness. Stress in general is a risk factor for being non-resilient. If we want people to be resilient, we have to help them have less stress. So this is research of Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF, for which, by the way, she won a Nobel Prize. And what she found is the shortening of the telomeres, because you got to have telomeres for your cells to divide, is associated with an increase in cancer, depression, pulmonary fibrosis, dementia, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, and that's just the beginning of the list. Exercise protects telomeres. What's happened in our schools to exercise, for heaven's sakes? It's not in there anymore. It's difficult. This is kids need to burn off energy, and they need that so that they don't store stress chronically in their bodies. Just a little bit more on the science of this, because at dinner last night, one of my dinner parties partners was talking about the recent evidence on inflammation. And what we understand is that inflammation is the final common pathway in virtually every chronic illness. And it's also implicated, by the way, in mental health. So one measure of inflammation is the overproduction of a molecule called interleukin-6. It's made by your white blood cells. And IL-6, the more IL-6 you have from either being emotionally or physically stressed, the more inflammation you will have. And also mental health issues. If you are depressed or if you are anxious, it raises this, it's called a pro-inflammatory cytokine, IL-6. And inflammation is a commonality in virtually every chronic disease, from heart disease to diabetes, from osteoporosis to the frailty of aging, to some cancers, and as I've said now twice, almost all chronic illness. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about diet, epigenetics, and then finish up today by talking about the brain. So chronic stress, we know, is a trigger for a huge diversity of psychiatric disorders, including depression. And one of the ways this happens is via dysregulation of the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. And what happens now is that we have, with every system of the body, you have multiple feedback loops, things that drive the system in one direction, things that drive it back in the other. What balances some of the stress to the HPA axis is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. That not only regulates the HPA axis, but it also causes neurons to divide and rewire. And we all know brain neuroplasticity is the big deal. You're not stuck with what you've got because the brain can rewire itself. But look at this. In rats exposed to mild chronic stress for 4 weeks, BDNF expression was found to play a very critical role in resilience. And there's lots of data coming out now on BDNF in humans too. So how do we get more or less BDNF? Well, BDNF is decreased by eating diets that are high in saturated fat. And you know, this is a big thing. Saturated fat, by and large, has gotten a bad rap. Some saturated fat is actually important and good for us. This is all new stuff. But if you're eating lots of it, it does decrease BDNF. So do refined carbohydrates, sugar and flour. I saw my friend David Perlmutter's book, Grain Brain, on your book table. And David is a neurologist who has really done a very good job showing how it is that even whole wheat bread gets broken down into sugar. And it's our ability to metabolize high levels of carbs that makes all the difference to our health. So a sedentary lifestyle. And so you think, what are kids getting for school lunches? Saturated fat, refined carbs, and they get to sit on their butts all day. No wonder we've got a problem. Do you know that, I think I said this before, millennials are the single most anxious generation that we have ever seen. The standard American diet, aptly abbreviated SAD, and our plugged-in lifestyle has a lot to do with depression and anxiety. I mean, what do we think? Of course this makes a difference. And although we may network electronically and, you know, be totally connected, ever see a bunch of kids sitting in the same room? Instead of talking to each other, they text each other, you know, and they're in talking range. Social support turns out to be critical, both for the function of our immune system and the function of our nervous system. And human beings, this is the primate nervous system. We evolved to be able to help each other self-regulate, and we have to be face-to-face to do that. All right, what increases BDNF? Well, turns out a Mediterranean type of diet that is rich in nuts, vegetables, we have blacked out over there, but rich in nuts, vegetables, whole grains, and in that case, fish turns out to be very good for us. That fish, depending on the type of fish, has a lot of omega-3 fatty acids. I just happened to meet up with a woman at a program that I was giving a couple of weeks ago who had recently gotten grants for studying suicide prevention in returning soldiers. And what she is studying is actually supplementing their diet with omega-3 fatty acids, and not enormous amounts, 2 to 3 grams a day. And the background literature suggests, thank you very much, that may actually cut down on the number of suicides. Also, she has a grant to study omega-3 fatty acids in depression. So we need good fats. And the literature on fats is changing a lot. It turns out that these PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids that we're supposed to eat for our heart, may not be so healthy at all. And the data on this is changing all the time. The whole cholesterol data has changed. And here's a very interesting thing. Back in the day when I was still at Harvard, 25 years ago, there was already a fairly robust literature showing that men with the lowest cholesterol levels had the highest depression levels. No wonder, because there's nothing good to eat when you get rid of all of the cholesterol. However, that data has continued. We need cholesterol. It's part of the myelin sheath. And these days, they don't even care what your cholesterol is. They just put the whole universe on statins And there are times, by the way, when you need statins, but it's not so cut and dry. And the field is literally changing a week at a time. But what I can say is BDNF is increased by curcumin. And it's interesting, if you go to Village India, where people are taking turmeric and assorted other spices in that genre, and they're sauteing the spices up in oil, that makes the turmeric and turmeric-like molecules bioavailable, there's almost no Alzheimer's disease. It turns out, we think, that that's due to the increase in BDNF. Walnuts, avocados, a diet that is, I'd call it carb reasonable, not too many carbs, is good for BDNF. And thank God, so is coffee. Some people, however, are caffeine sensitive. If you're caffeine sensitive, you got to go for water processed decaf. You know, I had my genetic testing done for diet, and it turns out I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine. I thought, what a relief. Okay, so fasting and calorie restriction also increases BDNF, which is why there's probably such a robust literature on calorie restriction and longevity. All right, now I wanted to just alert you to the microbiome because you read so much about that lately. So what is the microbiome? It is the entire community of bacteria that live inside your gut. And turns out that that is the big elephant in the living room of health and mental health, is the gut bacteria. So this is so cool. It turns out that you and I are composite organisms that were made of about 10 trillion human cells and 100 trillion bacteria. Do you know that 99% of our genes are bacterial genes? So that is rather humbling, don't you think? And since we started to eat like lots of processed foods and no fiber, things are not going well for our microbiome because it's supposed to be diverse. Your gut bacteria, you know, think about probiotics. That's what we all have, probiotics living in us, but you have to feed them. Probiotics need to eat prebiotics, which are fiber. And in the typical fast food SAD diet, there's not enough fiber to keep your probiotics happy. Your microbiome is losing its diversity, losing its function, and this is not so good because the bacteria are there because they're part of the ecosystem of our body, and they have what the scientists call ecosystem functions, including that they keep your gut lining intact. Have you noticed that there's much more autoimmune disease now than there used to be? In part, that's because these gut bacteria are responsible for keeping the tight junctions between the cells in your gut tight so that, God forbid, no poop is getting out there, and bacterial endotoxins, a little bit of the cell membranes that you mount an immune response to. So they're supposed to help to keep your gut lining intact. But here's the big thing. The lion's share of neurotransmitters in your body are not made in your brain. They are made by your gut bacteria. And if your gut bacteria are in a bad state, your neurotransmitters are in a bad state too. And so much for, you know, a value judgment about being anxious or depressed. You're anxious or depressed in part because your gut bacteria aren't being fed well. Gut bacteria also regulate weight. If you have too many of one kind of bacteria, Firmicutes, they're thrifty bacteria. And it's great in a famine because you can chomp on tree bark and they will make fatty acids out of it. But it's not so good if you're not in a time of famine because you can eat very, very little and you will be fat. A different kind, Bacteroidetes, help to regulate weight and keep you thin. And now they've done experiments where they take bacteria from the stomachs, digestive tracts, intestines of thin people, wash them, install them into the guts of overweight people, and without changing what they eat, the overweight people start to get thin. So, this is huge. Who would have thought our mental health had to do with gut bacteria or our weight or the regulation of our immune system? So we're at a time of rapidly changing scientific knowledge that we need to look at. Okay, what's the second elephant in the living room of mental health and physical health? I would say that it's epigenetics. So what is epigenetics? Technically, epi means above. It means above the genes. So here's the scoop. The human genome is fairly constant, and it changes very slowly over millions of years. This is a good thing, that a baby born today looks just like a baby born 10,000 years ago. It doesn't look like an aardvark or an armadillo or what else. On the other hand, the environment around us changes all the time, doesn't it? We've even had to adapt to the food that we eat. And by the way, food is one of the chief epigenetic actors. So a science called epigenetics explains how our genes can adapt to changes in the environment, even though the actual structure of the genome, the genes themselves, do not change. So that, for example, if you eat a lot of greens, foliage, it contains a lot of a molecule known as folate. Folate and foliage comes from the same root. Folate donates methyl groups to your DNA, and when you have methyl groups, it silences certain genes. On the other hand, foods containing more acetyl groups, when they bind to not so much your DNA, I don't want to get too technical, too wonky, but it binds to something called a histone protein in the nucleus of the cell. That causes genes to be active. And so everything in your environment, including things like, do you live in a household where there's violence? Do you live in a household where your mother is treated in a disrespectful way? Are you chronically stressed because of food insecurity? Are you chronically stressed because you live in a bad neighborhood or, God forbid, have no house to live in at all? All of these things turn out to be epigenetic modulators. But the one we all have in common is what we eat. So here's an interesting thing. I have 7 grandchildren. They range from 21 to 5. And this is the youngest one, Bodhi, who's 5 now. And a number of studies have been done that show that when there's trauma in a family, the trauma, the epigenetics from the trauma lasts for up to 4 generations. It's really pretty interesting. I used to think to myself, well, wait a minute. My life wasn't so hard. Why do I look like a trauma survivor? Which in my earlier years, I did. If you looked at my history, a lot of things looked just like I had been terribly traumatized. But on the other hand, I'm Jewish. My grandparents came from parts of Russia and Belarus where there were constantly pogroms. Round everybody up, put them in a barn and light the thing on fire. And it turns out that those are heritable, that if you have people in your family lineage up to 4 generations ago who were traumatized, you yourself will show lack of resilience and look like, in some ways, a trauma survivor. This is true also for example, there was a famine at the time of Hitler. There was a town in Holland that didn't have enough food. It was all given to the German troops. And most of the women who were pregnant at that time miscarried. The ones who did carry through to term obviously had low birth weight babies with a multiplicity of physical problems, both as children and adults. But when those children grew up and were well nourished, their children ended up with the same kinds of physical and emotional problems as they had. And this carried through to the grandchildren of these folks as well. So this is something also we have to look at, that family history of trauma is very important to a person's resilience. These, by the way, are my 12 relatives who died in Auschwitz. And I realized, no wonder I'm not too stress hardy. Although I've worked on it for years, I'm pretty good now. And this, when Irene introduced me, she introduced the title of my new book, The Plant Plus Diet Solution, Personalized Nutrition for Life, because it also turns out that we're all unique in terms of what we need to burn. Some people are better off as vegans. Some people can eat meat. Some people can eat grains and others can't. So what are we supposed to eat for mental health? And by the way, if you want my book, just put Plant Plus in Amazon, it'll come. We should be eating whole foods, not processed foods. That's thing number one. If you eat a pound of fresh vegetables and fruits daily, but not fruit juice, you will be much healthier. Fruit juice is basically not only 100% sugar, but it's fructose and it's liver destroying. The more fruit juice a child drinks, by the way, the more likely they are to be obese. And unfortunately, let's say in the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children, what they give out for poor children to eat is fruit juice. Big mistake. Okay, nuts, olive oil, coconut oil, good fats, not industrial derived polyunsaturated fats. And plus foods depend on your own physiology and preference. So I want to talk a little bit now. Oh my God, I talked too long. A little bit about the hero's journey. Let's say things have gone against you and you find yourself in the position of you're not too resilient. You've got a client. They have a difficult life. They have multiple things going on in their life, and they're not too resilient. One of the things that I found very useful is to have a way to talk to people about that and to say, you know, all the great Hollywood stories, from Star Wars to Life of Pi, are based on the hero's journey. That growth always comes to people at a time when their world is falling apart. And indeed, having a difficulty in your life sets you up for a rite of passage to true resilience. And that rite of passage has 3 parts. First of all, something happens that disrupts life as usual. It could be becoming homeless. It could be getting cancer. It could be a financial reversal or a divorce, or my God, it happens to us all the day. And this phase of the hero's journey is called separation, because you separate from life as usual, and it gives you a chance to reconfigure at a higher level. The second part of a rite of passage is called liminal space. It's the time between what was no longer and what is not yet. And in liminal space, that's a place where you find your allies. And I think all of you are allies to people in liminal space. And you help them sort their lives out and develop a little bit more self-awareness and maybe some skills of different sorts. And this is a fantastic thing that we get to do, is to be allies in liminal space. And that's a place, I call it sacred space, because if you can't go back to what your world was like, and you have to face every day the unknown and uncertainty, if you have the right help, it's a time of great learning. It's also a time, by the way, where people have to grieve what was, and also it's a time when they become more grateful for what they have. The third part of the hero's journey after separation and liminal space is you develop some wisdom, and you return to life wiser than you were before, and oftentimes with a desire to help other people. And this is what I think the hope of resilience is, that it helps to make us whole. Okay, we know now a lot of how this works through the field of cognitive neuroscience, and we know that our feelings and our thoughts work together so that we can integrate the brain. And when we create new meanings for traumatic events, like, okay, here it is, I'm an initiate in a great journey. That's what I used to tell people with AIDS and cancer who came to my clinic. They would say, well, I have this terrible disease, I'm a victim. And I would say, no, you're not a victim. You're an initiate in a great journey, in the hero's journey. And this is a time of remaking your life. And by creating new meanings like that for traumatic events, what we know about the brain now is you can calm down your worry circuits and build resilience circuits. So this is just a little quote from Diane Coutu, who was at the time I found this quote in the Harvard Business Review, a staff writer for the Harvard Business Review. And she looked over the whole literature on resilience. This was about 5-6 years ago. And she looked at the literature on resilient companies and said it's the same as for resilient individuals, whether you're looking at Holocaust survivors, people who are sick, people who have been raped, or the whole gamut. And here's what she said. She said, resilience is a reflex, a way of facing and understanding the world that's deeply etched into a person's mind and soul. Resilient people and companies, here are the 3 traits, face reality with staunchness. And that's very important. Wishful thinking does not make people resilient. Wishful thinking makes people weak. You have to look at it and say, yep, this is what's going on and this is what I've got to do. The second trait is to be able to make meaning of hardship. And I do believe that spirituality is a lot about the making of meaning, so that you have higher level values to aspire to in life. And the third trait of resilience is the ability to improvise. And that's pretty cool. I think mindful people are creative people, and we can train mindfulness. So we're going to take the last few minutes here to just quickly look at some of the new neuroscience that's coming out about this. And what's so important about the new brain science, of course, is that it's based on the recent findings over the last 15 years or so, that the brain is constantly changing itself, that it's able to rewire. So if you were looking down on the top of somebody's head, if you just lifted their skull off, and here's their nose here, I want to focus on the prefrontal cortex, the very front of the frontal lobes, which is right behind the forehead and behind the eyes. Here's the medial part in the middle, because you've got prefrontal cortex on both the right and the left frontal lobe. If you were to take a sagittal section that is cut this way between the lobes, what you would see, I see what I did. What you would see over here is, here's the frontal cortex, here's the bottom of it, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Here's the amygdala, where fear and stress and rage and depression come from. And the prefrontal cortex is actually able to modulate these difficult emotions coming up from the amygdala. So what we do know, kind of back to the Dalai Lama, happy is here in the left prefrontal cortex. He's a very resilient, happy guy, and that's despite the fact that his country underwent a terrible Holocaust. And so what does he know that we don't? Well, I loved this slide. I thought to myself, well, that's good. A kiss to the prefrontal cortex can definitely make it all better. That when we bond with others, when we feel TLC, when we're cared for, it stimulates our left prefrontal cortex. Sharon Begley's a science writer. She used to be the science writer for Newsweek. I think she's at Reuters now. But she's hung out a lot with the scientists who study emotions and hung out a lot with people like Daniel Goleman and with Richie Davidson, who's probably the premier neuroscientist studying mindfulness at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. But Sharon, I once had a chance to be a commentator on a lecture she gave, and this is a piece of the lecture. She said, the amygdala is that region that sends out signals. Be afraid, be depressed, be on your toes for signs of danger. And when those signals are going full blast, it's very hard to be resilient. So the prefrontal cortex basically says to the amygdala, shh, quiet down. And when it's able to do so, people are able to be resilient. The activation of the left prefrontal cortex in a resilient person can be 30 times that of someone who isn't resilient. So we have a little target here behaviorally. How do you train more activity in the left prefrontal cortex? And this will be the last 2 or 3 minutes of what I have to say. Well, we have a calmer downer circuit. And you know, you can't help anybody. And they can't learn anything if their amygdala is triggered, because that cuts off the rational thought and goal orientation and executive functions of the prefrontal cortex. So the calmer downer circuit is this: GABA, which is a neurotransmitter, gamma aminobutyric acid. It's an inhibitory neuropeptide made in the orbitomedial prefrontal cortex, what you saw between the lobes. Dan Siegel, who I bet many of you know well, calls this part of the upstairs brain. When released, GABA turns off the alarm raised by the amygdala, and it calms what Siegel calls the downstairs brain, the subcortical areas. And that has to do not only with the brain stem, not only with the limbic areas, but your brain is a network that goes throughout your whole body, including your gut bacteria. They're an important part of your nervous system. So how do we make a left shift? Here are the tools. And these are tools that have been studied, and then I have another list of things that I hope will be studied soon. Mindfulness makes a left shift. Both mindfulness meditation and the kind of training where you just say to somebody, when you take a shower, be in the shower. Feel the suds, enjoy the soap, feel the massage, it's nice. And when you start thinking and planning your day, just take a breath and go back to feeling the sensations. Just doing mindfulness exercises in daily life will help make a left shift. Any form of meditation at all, including moving meditation, like yoga or qigong exercises, will make the left shift. And you know, the latest is, I think all of you know, in trauma treatment is somatic. Start with the body, and the body affects the mind. And I know that certainly up in Boston, Bessel van der Kolk's clinic is using a great deal of yoga and qigong types of approaches. Another way to make a mental left shift is through any mental training technique. Slogans. Think about the AA slogans. Reframing any of the alphabet therapies, you know, CBT, ACT, DBT, you and me, whatever you've got. And changing one's story through creating new meaning. There's a whole new field now called narrative medicine, and that's what it is, and it changes the brain. Exercise and breathing, especially any type of breathing exercise that involves long, slow exhalations. These are easy things to teach and train, and we need to start them in school when kids are small and develop the activity that they need to be resilient later in their life. And last little bit, we need to do it ourselves. We need to be a healing presence. And this is part of the whole new field of interpersonal neurobiology. Joseph Martin was formerly the dean of Harvard Medical School, and when he was addressing the medical students, he said, "I've come to believe that it's through the establishment of a unique doctor-friend-patient relationship that most of the healing occurs, whether helped along by surgery, acupuncture, or regular doses of approved medicine." So if we don't take care of ourselves and if we burn out, then all is lost, because we need to be the facilitators and guides in this process. This is just a quote from Thomas Merton. And he, as many of you know, was a Catholic priest who had steeped himself in Zen meditation and was trying to bring meditation back into the mainstream Catholic Church. And a young activist, and I think you're all activists, you do what you do to help other people, and we're the ones who burn out first. So this is what he wrote to a young activist. He said, "There's a pervasive form of contemporary violence, activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything, is to succumb to violence. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful." So I think we need more vacations, more laughter, more fun, and to take care of ourselves. And so I'm going to leave you with this last slide, that you can change your brain and change your life by little vacations even during the day. And that is by literally stopping to appreciate the moments that your own essential self, which is at home in yourself, and you feel a sense of peace or love or compassion or beauty when these come up. So when a stranger smiles at you and you weren't expecting it, if you stop and you feel it, you can feel all those good positive changes in your body. When your dog licks you, that's my husband and one of our 2 standard poodles. That's Mr. Milo, the pet healer. And a moment with those dogs, you actually feel it, and you feel the positive things. And then at night, before you go to bed, you rerun at least one thing from the day that really touched you like that you were mindful of, that you paid attention to. And that single practice of gratitude will help you make a left shift. It will help you not to burn out so fast and to keep your prefrontal cortex online. So when somebody says, "Do you want to go away next weekend?" you say, "Sure," instead of, "I've got too much work to do." So that's it. I want you to take good care of yourself, and I hope that for those of you who are driving home, you have a safe drive home, and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome.
I know most of you all are making your way out. You can keep going. I'm just going to talk here to those who are left. So I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been a great conference. We've heard wonderful things from many of you. We've also gotten good constructive feedback from many of you also. We appreciate that also. And we continue to try to make the symposium better and better. I want to just acknowledge our presenting sponsors, Phyllis and George Dodson and the Zarrow Families Foundations. Make sure you look in the on-site brochure at all the different sponsors and supporters we've had. My friend over there, Hillary Carter from Otska, we appreciate Otska for their contributions. We want to thank always the Zarrow families, and we got a chance to honor Maxine and the late Jack Zarrow last night, and hope some of you were there for that and enjoyed that very much, and it was a great time hearing Patrick Kennedy. So again, we love you guys. We couldn't do this if you weren't with us, and it means a lot to us. I just want to thank you all, and we hope to have you back next year, and it means a lot to us. So thank you very much. Oh, and I want to just real quickly give our staff. They've done a great job. Give them a hand, would you please? Yay. And Al, you and Aaron Womble, now Carlozzi, co-chairing it in your committee. We really appreciate you guys. And so we'll see you at the Zarrow Symposium next year. Thank you.